What's up, guys? I've got a standard tier list for you. It's been suggested in my stream, so I have to deliver. Yeah, it's going to be just what decks are best right now, what I think you guys should be playing, kind of just my thoughts on the meta. And that's about it. Enjoy. So, let's just get started. First deck on the list is Golgari Talent. I'm going to put this in S tier. It has pretty good results. I am pretty impressed with this deck. It's a solid mid-range deck that has just a combo kind of slapped onto it that doesn't really make the deck any weaker. I think the Innkeeper's Talent is just a solid card in the deck, and if you can combo off with it, fine. You've always got the potential, but it by itself is just a really, really solid mid-range deck. Has value with Mosswood Dread Knight. Overall, really, really solid. And I'll kind of talk about its matchups as we get through into other decks, but definitely something that definitely belongs in S tier. Or you could maybe put it top of A tier, but I'm gonna put it as. Next deck we got is Rakdos Lizards. So this deck I think this deck is really, really strong. I don't know. I think I'd put it in A tier. I don't think it's quite S. It has a lot of hand hate. It doesn't, so you can kind of play around stuff in terms of, you can grab out temporary lockdowns or malicious eclipse or whatever board clear they have. And then you kind of get to these these stalling board states where they just kill you with, 1 damage on repeat. It's not as quick as some of the other, decks we're going to talk about on this list, but it has a lot of, it's persistent. It is persistent in what it does. It can grab back a lot of their threats from the graveyard with the land. I forgot what the land's called, but the one that gets lizards back. It has a little bit of everything. It has removal, hand hate, and just really, really solid creatures that give a lot of value. The 2-drop, the 2/1 that exiles 2 cards every time they do damage. That card is crazy, absolutely crazy. Next deck we got is Gruul Slickshot. This is going all the way up to S tier. I think this deck is absolutely insane. They kill you with a good hand on turn 3. With a bad hand, they're still just beating you down, and it's really hard to deal with their board. The only way to consistently deal with their board is through temporary lockdowns, and it's almost too slow. It can be too slow on, if they're on the play and they kill you on turn 3. And they also, if you're playing against a good Gruul Slickshot player, they're holding, Slickshot in their hands. They're just plotting him, playing one guy a turn, and it's you can temporary lockdown, but as long as they don't overplay their board, they're still going to have plenty of gas left after you drop the temporary lockdown, and you might even die the next turn because you've tapped out. It's a crazy. I haven't played this deck much, but I played against it a lot, and it is very, very, very strong. Next deck we got is Domain. Domain, I wouldn't say is quite S tier, definitely not D tier. We're gonna put it A tier, I think. Yeah, we're gonna put it A tier, and I'd say, I think the problem. I do think Domain's very good. I probably would put it over Lizards. The only issue I find with Domain currently at this time is that there are some combo decks running around, and it kind of loses to them. It can sideboard in Negates. It can sideboard in Tishanas. It is very, very strong. Don't get me wrong. And I would almost put it S, but I do think what it does is it's not unbeatable these days. It's very, very strong. Obviously, Atraxa is a crazy, crazy card, and when they drop Atraxa, you're probably losing the game. But there's a lot of decks on this list that can kind of deal with Domain, and there's a lot of ways that people do sideboard for it, and it is you can sideboard against it. Next we got Jeskai Convoke. Or, I think there is Boros list, but I think the most popular one is the Jeskai one. I think the Jeskai one's pretty strong. It's not as strong as the Boros one, and I don't know exactly why that is. I think it might just have to do with, you know, the mana and I was talking to my friend and he said the pain lands are a big problem. So pain lands, you know, you're gonna have a worse matchup into like the Gruul Slick Shot. You're not, you know, you can't really deal with it against other decks. And Temporary Lockdown still hits it hard. It does have counter spells, which are pretty important. So you can play around, you know, you can beat Temporary Lockdown with this deck. And it's still a solid deck. I would keep it in A tier. I don't see too much of it. When I play against it, it seems pretty solid, but I'm not like crazy impressed. And yeah, I think I would put it here. I think it's worse than Lizards, worse than Domain, and definitely worse than anything in S tier. Next we've got is Dimir. I would say Dimir is probably A tier. Top, you know, maybe top of A tier. It is very strong. This deck, the amount of times that they just hold up 2 mana, slap down to 2/1, or counter your spell, it's really hard to play against. If they have the correct hand, you kind of just are sitting there and unable to do anything and just getting poked down until they drop a Gix, draw a bunch of cards. It's just a very, they don't do anything crazy, but for what it is, Dimir midrange is very strong. They're just playing all solid cards and counters, and it's you know, and they're playing on your turn, so it's very hard to interact with. I would say it's very strong, and it beats some of the other decks really hard that we're going to kind of talk about. Destroys Domain, absolutely destroys Domain. You have, you know, there's not much you can do. You're getting rushed down, and they have counters. You need Cavernous Souls, but you also have to get to Cavernous Souls in the first place, which is, you know, you have to get to your Atraxa. And even when you drop Atraxa, they could just be holding a Gopher Throat and be swinging for lethal. Very good deck. Has maybe some trouble against, you know, some of the aggro decks or things that just play on curve, you know, like Golgari. Like they're dropping a 2-drop. What are you going to do? You're going to cut down their Dread Knight? Fine. You know, they're going to bring it back or play another one, or, you know, play a bat. Just too many things to deal with. When there's limited threats, Dimir really shines. Next deck we got is Squirming Emergence. This deck has seen some play. I've seen this deck quite a bit. I do think this is B tier. I think this deck right now we're seeing like I've been seeing a lot of it, but it's really the only graveyard deck. And if this deck becomes too good or too popular, people will side in Graveyard Hate, and it will kind of fall off. It does a very strong thing, don't get me wrong, but that's kind of all it does. And if you can stop their graveyard, it's really susceptible to Graveyard Hate. And because of that, I think it's kind of left to B tier until it has a way to, you know, and there's even more Graveyard Hate coming in Duskmourn. There's going to be the 1-mana artifact that you can tap and exile a card from a graveyard, and there's also going to be Leyline of the Void, you know, which will absolutely shut this down. So it's kind of sitting in a weird place. It's B tier. If it's kind of hard for it to move up, because if it ever gets to A tier, people are gonna put more sideboard options in. If it ever becomes more popular, people are gonna, you know, start putting Rest in Pieces in, Leyline of the Void, Cutzel, whatever, to kind of interact with it. It is a solid deck. It does do a fast thing, but, you know, very susceptible to post sideboard. Next deck we got is Azorius Control. I would put this probably maybe right below. I'd put it right below Dimir, I think. This deck, so I've played a good amount of Azorius Control. I have probably like a 67-70% win rate with it. It isn't the strongest deck for sure. You could even put this lower, like maybe it's somewhere here. You know, maybe I could go even lower here. It still does the Azorius Control thing. it's positioned fairly well in a meta where there's a lot of combo decks going around. You have Golgari talent, you've got, you know, even like Domain, it can deal with Domain, Squirmy Emergence, and well, there's some more, but yeah, it can deal with the combo decks. It does okay into aggro, especially if you have the right list. You're running Elspeth Smites, Bezas. Like you definitely need to have main board for aggro. And the worst matchup for this deck, the problem with this deck is just kind of like the standard like mid range. Like I find that Golgari kind of just beats you down most of the time. You'd think it would be like a fairly solid matchup, but you just can't counter everything they're doing. They're putting threats on the board every time. They've got hand hate. Same with like Lizards. Lizards is pretty hard to deal with. You do have temporary lockdowns, but they have so much hand hate. And if you just can't remove a certain piece, if you don't draw your removal on time, they're drawing, they're getting so much value with Jasper, so much value with the 2/1. And you're just in a slogfest. Yes, you can beat them. Yes, like you can absolutely win the matchup, but it is an absolute pain. Next deck we got is this. I would say this is just mono red, and I would put this probably pretty low on my list. I would say this is probably B tier. The best list of this are doing. They are still very strong, but if you're gonna play red, I think we need to be going into green for protection. If we're just playing standard, Monstrous Ridges or Ras Forge, it's just, people are playing like they're going to play against Gruul Slickshot. They know that red is in the meta. I think this deck is just a little slower than it needs to be. It's still very good. I'd put it above Squirmy Emergence. It's still a red deck. It's still very good. But I do think that if you're going to play aggro, you're better off playing Gruul Slickshot, Jeskai, and some of the other ones that we got on this list. Next deck I'm going to talk about is Caretaker's Talents. So Caretakers, this could go for the Jeskai list. This could go for the the Boros list, or even like the mono white list. I would say this is either bottom of A tier or top of B tier for me. This deck is very, very good against certain matchups. You will absolutely, you're going to do well against, like, let's say, depending on the list, if it's Boros, you've got Torch the Towers, you've got, what's the Lightning Helix, and those cards are very, very good against aggro most of the time, and you can sideboard in temporary lockdowns and whatnot. You can run Bezas. You have a ton of life gain, but the problem with this deck, and why I think maybe the Jeskai version is the best, is that it absolutely gets crushed by combo decks, because you kind of just sit there and don't do anything, and you ultimately win with caretaker value and just putting things on the board. But without blue, the deck gets absolutely crushed by Domain, Squirmy Emergence, even like, if you're running only, if you have limited enchantment hate, you can easily lose the Golgari combo. Like, yes, you can deal with their board and you won't lose that, but there's always a chance that they're just going to talent and you're going to die to a Vraska. Next deck we got here is Azorius Mentor. So this is a Haughty Djinn deck. I would go B on this. This deck, I haven't seen it played much, but I do think this is pretty good. I could even go A tier on this. I'm just not confident. I haven't seen enough of this deck. The decks that I play, like, it's great. It seems good against some of these Azorius control decks. My fear with this deck is, and I have not played this deck too much, but I would assume it loses really hard to red decks. And that's kind of the thing keeping some of these decks down, is the Haughty Djinn decks, some of these combo decks, is really like, can you deal with red efficiently, right? And that's why we've seen like a lot of white decks splashing around, a lot of black. They've got cut downs. White has a lot of, they got temporary lockdowns and Elspeth Smites to deal with red decks where you're just going to get crushed if you're if you're, just trying to counter every spell or bounce their units. If you're playing a tempo game plan, tempo's great and all, but I do think it has trouble against, just smashing your face with a slick shot. First deck in C tier. I added this deck. I think I've seen this deck on the ladder quite a bit. I'm going to put kind of like the Orzhov Blink decks, or even like the Dimir discard decks. Any of these decks that are running Braids, they're running like Tithing Blades, they're running, the enchantment discard thing, the 1 mana, what is that card called? Can't remember. But decks that have Braids in it, they were pretty good at a time. They're very good against red decks. They are very, very good against red decks. They're very good against even like, I think they're good against decks that don't have a value engine, and you can just trade down the board, and then you kind of slowly sorry about that, regain your value. Let me take a sip of water here. Against red, like, this deck can really pop off. You have a lot of cheap removal. You have removal that sacrifices their units so that even Snakeskin Veil can't protect them. You've got food tokens. So in terms of that, like, I think this deck is well positioned to beat red decks in specifically. But when you're playing against decks like Domain, like Azorius Control, they don't, or even like Jeskai Convoke, right? They don't really care about you making them sack creatures. They don't even necessarily care, like, in terms of Azorius Control. Sure, you can make them discard, right? You take all your creature hate out. But at the end of the day, like, they will just draw more cards, keep their lands, keep playing lands, and at some point they're going to outdraw you. They have better top decks than you, and you really, really have to pop off to beat these decks. It also loses to the 4/7, what is that card called? 4/7 Vigilance that stops things from when they ETB. It stops them from going off. What is that card called? Elish Norn. So I played this deck a lot just because I find it as it's such a fun archetype for me. Making people discard their hands, it's great. But if they drop Elish Norn, there's not a way to beat that card in your deck. Sure, you can put Go for the Throats in, but it's not really what you want to be doing. You cannot beat Elish Norn at all. And Elish Norn is, it's gotten a little bit less popular, but it's still like a popular sideboard card. People are sideboarding that in for their Atraxas or whatnot. And if they sideboard this in to you, you're going to have a rough time. The next deck, and this one is going to be maybe a little surprising to people, is Vine Lasher Combo. I'm going to put Vine Lasher Combo in A tier. I actually think the most clean-cut version of this deck is really, really good. The deck can pop off at like turn 5, and it is when you do it, when you Pitiless Carnage sack your board, you pretty much win the game. If you get a Pitiless Carnage off, the game is pretty much over. You run 8 copies of it, so you've got your 4 Pitiless Carnage, and then you have 4 ways to get the Pitiless Carnage with, and I'm blanking on the card name. What is that? Pillage the Bog. So, you're running Pillage the Bogs, you're running 4 copies of that, you're running 4 Pitiless Carnage, and if you can find your Pitiless Carnage and they don't kill you by turn 5 or 6, you are absolutely popping off. Now, the problem with this deck is that if you don't draw Pitiless Carnage, you can win depending on the deck that you're playing against, but it's difficult if you can't get Pitiless Carnage off. So if people are running, Azorius Control and they counter your Pitiless Carnage, or they, even worse, they counter the card that you play after Pitiless Carnage to bring all your lands back, you've just lost the game. You cannot win. You have to play around counters. You can sideboard in duress. It's a little glass cannon-y, but it is very, very strong what it does. It has limited ways to interact with red, but I will say with the right sideboard, I've had pretty good success against red decks. You know, you sideboard in like Titania, the one that heals you 2 every single time a land's put in your graveyard. If that sticks on the board, it's a 3/4 reach unit. Red has a hard time dealing with it. Red has a, you know, you can just kind of life gain out of any situation. I think of combo decks, this one against red, I've been pretty impressed with. I thought it would be a terrible matchup, but you got cut downs, you got a good sideboard. You can absolutely deal with red. Okay, next we've got Orzhov midrange. This deck is going to shoot up to not only S tier, but literally the best deck for me right now. I think this deck is absolutely crazy. There were some experimentations with this deck, but I think why this deck is so strong is you don't just lose to mono red. You have cut downs, you've got go for the throats, you've got ways to deal with it, you got Liliana, you can make them sack. It beats other mid-range decks. You are like the tallest of the mid-range decks. And so your worst matchups are like Domain. And Domain, I will say, like, okay, Domain is very good against you, and it's a bad matchup, but after sideboarding, if you put in all your Cruel Claw heists, you put in all your duresses, this deck can just steal Atraxa from them, never let them play their big stuff, and you slap down like a Kaya, and you just slowly grind them out. It's not an easy matchup. It's not even a good matchup, but it is winnable. And it's probably the worst matchup this deck has. It's got a ton of value for fairly cheap. You can bring back like Lilianas with Zorline. Zorline is so insane. Like this card is so quality. That's why I put it as the picture. It's just quality. I love Zorline. Very, very cool. Very, very strong. We got 2 decks left. First, we got Otters. I will put this in C tier. I saw a list. I played against a list probably a week ago, playing Otters, and it was kind of a control list. And I would say it felt pretty strong for what they were doing. It's definitely not the strongest. I won't spend too much time on this. It's definitely not the strongest deck. I don't even, you can put it D tier. I'll put it C tier to respect the Otters. But it's a cool list. We've seen it running around. I've seen it running around Standard quite a bit. And, it's, I don't know how much I can really say it's a good deck, but it's a fun list that definitely has its ups and downs. I think with the right hand, this deck absolutely pops off, but the problem is if you don't have the right hand, it kind of just sits there and slowly gets outvalued or slowly gets beaten down. The last deck on the list is Mice, and I'd say I put Mice around B tier. I think I definitely put it over the red deck. And I'd probably leave it somewhere here. These are all fairly similar. I wouldn't say any ones are that much worse than the others. But I would say Boros Mice is pretty strong. I'd almost put it in A tier. It's very, very good. Again, I just don't see the reason to play Boros Mice over Gruul Slickshot. I could even put this A tier. I'll put it top of B tier, but it's very strong. I think the problem with this deck, and it loses a little too hard to temporary lockdown. You don't really have a way to play around temporary lockdown. You do a very strong thing in that your mice all have really, really good synergy with each other, but you kind of have to play out your entire hand for you to do the thing. Whereas Gruul Slickshot doesn't really have to play out their hand. They can play 1 to 2 units, keep swinging with them, and if your opponent removes them, then you can play more units out, right? You're able to plot your Slickshot when you have 2 mana available. If they're just holding up a counter or holding up removal, you can just plot your Slickshot, on turn 2 past the turn. Now your opponent did nothing with their turn 2. Whereas mice, you've got to develop on every turn to really make progress. And if you're not, you're going to have a hard time. Not to say that it's not, you can't play around things. It's just a little bit more difficult. That's the tier list. Let me know what you guys think about kind of where I put things. There might be some disagreements in the comments. I'd love to hear it below. And yeah, if since you made it all the way to the end of the video, you might as well like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.